Hey guys, welcome to Age of Absolutism Part 5. Today we're going to be moving away from Central Europe and moving all the way east to Russia and talking about the rulership of Peter the Great, and then tomorrow we'll talk about Catherine the Great. Now, we haven't discussed Russia that much in this class at all, really, and so to kind of give you a little bit of a background about Russia, we will be watching a video in class tomorrow that will explain some more. But if you would like to take the time at this moment to watch a video, now this video is about 22 minutes long. It's not required. It's just for those of you who want to get a little bit more information. It's going to tell you a little bit about Ivan the Terrible, who was the absolute ruler who started to centralize the authority in Russia before Peter the Great. And so you can learn a little bit about him and exactly why he was called the Terrible. Ivan IV is also known as Ivan the Terrible, and he comes from the house of Rurik, not from the house of Romanov, which we're going to talk about today. And one of the main things that he's known for is increasing the size of Russia, taking power away from the Mongols, and then also creating the position known as Tsar. You guys have heard of the Tsarist Russia. And so Tsar literally comes from the word Caesar, and that's where that title comes from, basically meaning king. After he died, unfortunately, Russia started to decline in power and influence, and they actually entered a time period known as the Time of Troubles. By the late 1600s, it had been clear to the rest of the world that, unfortunately, Russia was very far behind Western Europe in all areas. They, for example, still lived under the feudal system where serfs had no authority. They were very poor and rural. This picture kind of captures the climate of what the situation was like, economic situation was like in Russia. So eventually in 1645, so fast forward several years after Ivan's death, Alexis I of the Romanov family is going to become the next Tsar of Russia. So this is going to start the dynasty of what we know as the Romanovs. And then he would go on to rule Russia for nearly 30 years. He was a weak ruler, however, but one of the things that he's known for is being successful in fathering children. He had 5 boys and 8 girls, so there certainly was enough children for him to pass his rulership on to. While his wife was giving birth to their 14th child, unfortunately, she died. And so there was a nationwide contest that was held throughout Russia in order for Alexis to be able to pick his new bride. The winner was a woman who was mostly of Mongol blood. So you guys are familiar with the country of Mongolia in northern China, so more Asian than Russian. And she was able to give birth to 3 more children, so 1 boy and 2 more girls. So he now has 6 boys and 10 girls. The new boy's name, this new boy that was he gave birth to of the second wife, his name was Peter, and at a very early age, Peter started to show signs of great ability. And so it is important to understand, though, that there's going to pose a problem because only 2 of Alexis' sons from the first wife are still alive, and they, of course, are going to fight for the throne. That's Fyodor and Ivan. So even though both of them are going to fight for the throne, it is important to understand that they had very severe medical problems. This was very common in the Romanov family, probably some aspects of incest that we've talked about before with the Habsburgs. And many of them also suffered from a blood disorder known as hemophilia. Perhaps you've heard of it before. Ultimately, what it means is that your blood cannot clot. And so this was a genetic and hereditary disease that many of these family members suffered from. So Alexis, the one son, died a short time after Peter was born. So the only other son that was still alive was Fyodor III, and he was going to be the first rightfully able to gain the rulership of the Tsar. He ruled for 6 years, and then he had 2 other brothers that are going to mature in age at this time. He died without having any children, so Ivan V is going to be the next Tsar, which is one of his brothers. And fearing that Russia was going to be doomed with Ivan, being severely ill with his physical problems, the boyars, this is known as the Russian nobles. Remember, they're called the Junkers in Prussia, but they're boyars in Russia. They started to rebel because they were afraid then that there would be no rulership, and they didn't want to go back to the time of troubles that Russia had dealt with. So the goal that they had was to put Peter on the throne of Russia. And the reason for that is they believed that they would be able to control Peter. They could say to him, well, we put you on the throne, and then they would be able to make decisions and control him. So as a result, there became a huge power struggle between Alexis, remember the former king, his first and his second family. So his first wife and their children, and then his second wife and her children. And so it is important to note too, though, that Peter also was born with many health problems. So he wasn't immune to that either. For example, one of the things that he suffered from was facial tics, and they were extremely painful for him when it happened. It was like a muscle spasm in his face, and sometimes he even salivated or drooled when he spoke. However, despite his medical problems, it didn't affect him mentally. So he was extremely bright, and he definitely was capable of becoming the next Tsar. So Peter's side of the family wound up winning the struggle, and eventually Peter was able to win the title of Tsar at the young age of 9 years old. As he grew in age, he started to develop a very strong love of both education and also the military. He was very, very gifted academically as well, including science and history. He was very well educated, and so this is going to play into him becoming a very powerful ruler. He was married to a Russian boyar at the age of 17, so he was married to a Russian noble. And after he was crowned, his half-sister, who happened to be the oldest daughter from the first wife's side, organized a rebellion. Remember, we said there was a constant battle between the first and the second families of Alexis. So his first wife, her oldest daughter's name was Sophie, and she's going to organize a rebellion, basically saying that Peter was not the legitimate ruler of Russia. And so the Russian musketeers, or basically his army, actually wound up gunning down most of Peter's family right in front of his eyes. And so these people who took the side of Sophie, they were trying to remove Peter from the throne, and Peter lost some of his family, which is going to make him very angry, of course. So as a result of this, behind Peter's back, Sophie went ahead and crowned the only remaining son of Alexis, which was Ivan V. But it is important, remember I told you he had health problems, and so he was mentally ill, he was mentally retarded. And so she wanted him to be a co-czar along with Peter so that she would still be able to maintain some control for her side of the family. Honestly, we know that Sophie was the one who had the real power, because what is a mentally ill man going to do for a country? So 8 years later, Peter turned 17, and most of the boyars demanded that Sophie allow him to rule. And so they were trying their best to get her out of power, to remove Ivan from the throne, because he wasn't mentally fit in doing so, and Peter is now old enough to rule by himself. Of course, she refused. She said that both of the boys are incompetent and that she should be the ruler of Russia, and she actually took on the title of Tsarina. And so she feared Peter as he became older, because, as was mentioned before, he was showing great promises of a great leader. And so she tried to exile him so that he could not threaten her power. Of course, the attempt failed, and Peter went ahead and had Sophie sent to a convent, which is basically like a monastery for women. So he made her become a nun. A year later, Peter's half-brother Ivan, the one who was mentally ill, he had died, and so as a result, at the age of 18, Peter became the absolute ruler, or the Tsar of Russia. By this time, he had grown to about 6'8", and he was extremely energetic. So you can imagine he had a very strong presence about him. He was ahead of his time because what he started to do, very similar to what Frederick had done in Prussia, is he started to judge people based on their ability and not on their family. And this is traditionally not something that had been done in Europe or even in Russia, because everything was based on blood. But Peter wanted people surrounding him that had ability, not just nobility. His true passion, however, lied with the Navy, and he immediately started to build the Russian Navy from scratch. Now, I want you guys to think about this from a geographic standpoint. Russia isn't really known for its ports, that's for sure, especially in northern Russia because of the bad weather. But it was very important for Peter to build up a very strong navy. Ultimately, he, just like his peers in Europe, he wanted to become an enlightened ruler, an enlightened despot. And the reason for that is because he had a very high regard for Western Europe. He was very impressed at how they were able to rule from an enlightened way. He saw the success of England and France in building up their colonies, and he too wanted to be able to do that for Russia as well. So one of the things that he had to deal with as soon as he came to power was a major war against the Ottoman Empire. And so if you look at this map, this is the height of the Ottoman Empire in 1580. So we're about 100 years after this that we're talking about. But as you can see over there on the right of the map, the Ottoman Empire, right by the Caspian Sea, certainly posed a threat for the Russians. And so Peter, as we mentioned before, he was very strong in the military and military tactics, especially with his new command of this navy that he had built up. Russia was able to win a major victory and really put themselves on the map as a force to be reckoned with. So eventually the Russian Empire at this point under Peter started to grow, and Peter was becoming very popular throughout Russia because of what he was able to accomplish. He was convinced that Russia needed to be more like Western Europe. Ultimately, that is going to be his goal. He had seen the successes of Western Europe and even traveled there himself. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. And he wanted to bring those ideas back to Russia. So that's exactly what he did. He disguised himself as a commoner. He didn't want to stick out. I mean, he's already 6'8", so he's certainly going to stick out. But he decided to do a tour of Europe with a group of his nobility so that they could go to Europe and take back as much as they possibly could to Russia and apply it in their own country to get them up to speed with the rest of Europe. So one of the things that they started to learn was new medical procedures, all sorts of new philosophies. For example, he goes right in the height of the Enlightenment. And more than anything else, remember, his passion was the Navy, so he worked in shipyards, and he even memorized the blueprints of the ships that were being built in Europe, especially in the Netherlands. There's actually a statue of Peter here. This is a modern-day photograph of him building a ship in the shipyard in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Maybe you've heard that expression before. And so Peter took a big risk in touring Western Europe and leaving Russia unattended. And so while he was gone, there was a rebellion against him in Russia. And so what had happened, you guessed it, Sophie escaped from the convent, and she organized an army to try to challenge yet again the ruler of Russia so that she could put herself on the throne. So when Peter returned, he was able to crush the rebellion. And how was he going to deal with Sophie? Well, anyone who tried to overthrow Peter were brought to him. And this is where he's going to establish his power. He killed them He killed half of them personally. Sophie was sent back to the convent, and now only the other nuns in the convent, they were only allowed to talk to her on Easter Sundays. Otherwise, she was meant to be in solitary confinement. And all of the boyars who had taken her side in the rebellion were hung and put on display outside of her bedroom window. So in true Russian fashion, Peter the Great is going to show his power and display that anyone who tries to go against him, bad things are going to happen to them. So one of the things that Peter's going to try to do now in expanding his empire is to create a new capital city. And so he wanted to expand his empire west and also create a city that would really show off his rulership as well as the power of Russia and help have basically a place for this newfound navy of his. He hated Moscow. That had ultimately been the capital for so many years. He thought that it was old. He thought it was ugly, completely out of touch with the West. So he wanted to move the capital somewhere else. The only way for him to do this was if he was to expand northwest, but the only way that he would be able to do that is if he gained the land in war, and the war would have to be against Sweden. This is known as the Great Northern War, and this took place in 1699. The only problem that Peter had to deal with is he was not the only military genius in this equation. Sweden's king, Charles the 12th, was also a military genius. Charles attacked Peter's much larger forces during the middle of a blizzard. It is called the Great Northern War, after all, and they fought in the winter. Now, even though Peter had larger forces, Charles is going to come out on top. The Russians were completely confused. They actually believed that they were outnumbered by the Swedes. It was very difficult for them to see the situation, especially in this blizzard. And so the modern Swedish army, because they were more advanced than the Russians, they were able to beat back the outdated Russian forces. Remember, we said that Russia was not up to date with the rest of Europe at this time, and that included military. So Charles' army, believe it or not, was only about 8,000 men, but they constantly are going to slaughter Russians' forces of over 40,000. And the main reason for that is because Russia just wasn't as equipped. Their weapons were antiquated, and it became very difficult to try to fight back. So eventually Sweden got organized for an invasion. They kind of took a break. They stepped back for a little bit to organize themselves, and Peter quickly did his best to try to modernize his army as much as possible so that he would not admit defeat. So Sweden yet again invaded Russia, and they attacked Peter's army several different times, and Peter's army, it looked as if there was really no way for them to win. And this lasted for over 21 years. So the Great Northern War certainly can be the thorn in Peter's side. This was his weakness because he just wanted that city so bad. And for years, they just got plummeted until Charles eventually was captured by the Russians. And so this was their biggest mistake. They didn't kill him, but instead they actually sent him into exile in the Ottoman Empire. While there, Charles actually convinced the Ottomans to declare war on Russia. Now remember, Peter had already defeated the Ottomans once, but Charles was a military genius, and he was able to get the Ottomans on his side. The war went very badly for the Ottomans, unfortunately, and Peter's forces were actually able to gain even more territory, but it wasn't where Peter wanted it. This was in the south. So the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at that point said that Charles needed to be executed because he led him into a war that he couldn't win, but unfortunately for him, Charles had already escaped. He rode his horse across Europe in 15 days and yet again started to rally his armies for another attack against Russia. Sweden was victorious at first, just like they were, but their hopes of victory were vanquished when Charles was killed, and as a result, Sweden was forced to agree to peace. So this Great Northern War certainly is going to take a huge toll on both Sweden and Russia. As a result, Russia was able to gain a lot of land. They took the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, this was huge because these countries were pretty successful and were going to be able to bring in some revenue for Russia. They also were able to take command of Finland at this time. So even though Sweden remained pretty strong, we can say that its role as a major world power, remember that came upon them right after the 30 Years' War in 1648. But eventually now, because of this loss in the Great Northern War, Sweden is pretty much going to decline in power at this point. As a result of his victory in the Great Northern War, even though he lost for 21 years, ultimately he did come out on top. He became known as Peter the Great. So as a result, he wanted to set his sights on building himself a new capital, just like he had originally planned on doing. He wanted it to be what is known as the gateway to the West for Russia, or an opportunity for Russia to connect itself with Western Europe. And so he rounded up thousands of peasants, and he forced them to build the city of St. Petersburg. Yes, you heard me right. He forced them. If they didn't, they could risk death. The problem was, it was a very dangerous place to work because he wanted to build St. Petersburg in northern Russia, where it was swampy and just the conditions were terrible. I think your book goes into more detail on it. And so over 100,000 peasants died in building St. Petersburg. Many of them drowned, many of them died of starvation, many of them died of hypothermia. It was absolutely terrible. One of the things that he was trying to model the city after was Amsterdam, and he really wanted it to be the most beautiful capital city in all of Europe. Remember, we talked about how Louis XIV had kind of set the precedent with Versailles. Well, everybody wanted to do the same thing. Frederick did it in Prussia with Berlin, and now Peter's going to do it in Petersburg in Russia. He was actually very successful in doing so, building beautiful palaces, ornate gardens with fountains that you see here. And St. Petersburg really was a city that anyone marveled at. His new palace was, of course, going to be modeled after Versailles, as you can see with the fountains and the hundreds of rooms. And, of course, the sacrifice was the people whose hands that built it. So, as a result, Peter was able to have his gateway to the West, which is ultimately what he wanted. So, what about his personal life? While this city was being built in St. Petersburg, Peter fell in love with an Estonian peasant girl named Catherine. He divorced his first wife and married Catherine because this was his new love. He was so impressed with Catherine that he actually made her the official co-ruler of Russia. Now, ultimately, Peter saw the very foundation of Russian power as being the military, especially when he had been defeated for 21 years in the Great Northern War. He wanted to make sure that nothing like that would ever happen again. And so he built up Russia's army to over 400,000 trained soldiers. Now, that should sound familiar because it's very close to the army of France, but I want you to think about this. France is significantly smaller than Russia. So the fact that Peter was able to do this is pretty magnificent, especially because their military still was very primitive. They didn't have the advanced weaponry of Western Europe. They spent 96% of its economy on the military, and he was also the first to institute a draft. They were drafted into the army for either their life or the amount of time that Peter was the ruler of Russia. One of the things that he also wanted to do for Russia was modernize it in any way, try to bring it up to the standards of Western Europe as much as possible. So one of the things that he actually created was a beard tax. And so it was customary for men in Russia, especially because of the cold months, to have very long beards. But one of the things that he did is he required that men shave their beards so that they looked more like Western Europeans. And so this is just one of the ways that he was able to centralize his authority, was by a beard tax. Pretty interesting. However, it is important to understand that even though he is considered to be Peter the Great, one of his greatest accomplishments is St. Petersburg and the Great Northern War and centralizing the army, he really did very little to change the daily life for most Russians. For example, Russia was still under feudalism, so the serfs at the time, or the peasants, they did not have any rights. They were not able to gain freedom. And so this is kind of one of Peter's downfalls. They continued to work the lands of Russia. The boyars and the nobility dominated over them, and so they weren't really able to be successful in gaining any freedoms. So what's going to happen after Peter? Well, he had one son. His name was Alexei. But because Peter was on the move so much in building St. Petersburg and also going to Western Europe, his son was actually raised in the palace by noble women. So he didn't really have a lot of exposure to what it means to be a czar. So as you can see, Alexei and Peter are not going to have a very good relationship. In fact, Alexei hated the military. He did not want to follow in his father's footsteps, and all he wanted to do was just be rich and live a life of ease in the palace. So Peter didn't like this very much. He wanted to make sure that his legacy would continue, so he forced Alexei to join the military and also how to command the navy. So as a result, as you can imagine, Alexei hated Peter for it, and instead of catering to his needs, he wound up escaping Russia and fleeing to England by sea. Peter was furious at this and responded by writing Alexei a letter, and he swore that, look, all you got to do is come home, come back, let's figure this out, and I promise no harm will come to you. So he agreed. He came back to St. Petersburg, but unfortunately, on his way back, Peter had heard rumors that Alexei was actually coming back to overthrow him with an army. So he felt that his son was now a threat. So when he arrived in Russia, Peter had him arrested. He had his armies torture him for information. It was a hot mess. And so under torture, Alexei did confess that he wanted his father dead. Of course he wanted him dead. They had a terrible relationship. And so as a result, what did Peter do? In true Russian fashion, he had all of Alexei's friends impaled. Just another way to exert his authority. Alexei was then beaten with what is called a knot until he died. Basically, it means that he was beaten to death. Unfortunately, very, very sad outcome. So we really don't know if Alexei, in fact, was trying to overthrow Peter, but we do know that Peter took the threat very seriously, and unfortunately his son was killed because of it. So despite this cruelty, though, and these are just some of the ugly sides of the monarch, it's important to know that he is considered to be an enlightened monarch because of his love of education, because of what he was able to do for Russia's military. And most of his people loved him very, very much because even though he might not have changed the lives of the serfs, Russia's territory expanded under his rule and really was at its height of power at this particular time in history. So what's going to happen to Peter? Well, in 1725, he spotted a ship sinking off the coast of the capital, so right off of St. Petersburg. And being a very strong swimmer, he decided to rush into the freezing water so that he could save members of this crew. He actually survived, but unfortunately it made him very ill, and as a result he died of disease, probably some form of pneumonia, a short time later. So a noble death, that's for sure. But on his deathbed, he never made it known to the public who his heir would be, because his one son was now dead. And so who is going to be the next ruler of Russia? Well, I will pick that up in tomorrow's PowerPoint. But what I'd like for you to do right now is watch this video. It's by Tom Ritchie. It too, I believe, is about 18 minutes long. And it takes all of the information that I just presented to you in this PowerPoint and condenses it even further and gives you some more information that you need to know about why he was such a powerful absolute ruler. So please watch it and make a one-page summary. Again, do not be lazy. Some of you are giving me half pages. That's not acceptable. Please give me a one-page summary about what you've learned about Peter the Great in this video. And that wraps things up for tonight. I'll see you tomorrow.